He wasn't supposed to survive. The words echoed in the air, carried by the heavy smoke that clung to the ground like a blanket, suffocating everything in its path. Sergeant Jason Hayes, barely conscious, was trapped in the heart of the firestorm. His body was scorched, his vision blurred, and every breath he took seemed like it might be his last. But amidst the chaos and pain, there was one constant. His K9, Max, was there, fighting, pushing forward, and determined to do what no one thought possible. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a warrior. His amber eyes never wavered, and his paws burned with the urgency to save the man who had always been by his side. The flames roared around them, but Max didn't stop. The heat didn't matter. The smoke didn't matter. All that mattered was the mission: get Sergeant Hayes to safety. Max had learned loyalty in the harshest ways, through battles and fire, but nothing prepared him for this moment. As he dragged his handler out of the fire, the world seemed to slow down. The heat singed his fur, and the smoke threatened to suffocate him. But still, Max moved with purpose, pulling Jason further from the inferno. With every step, the weight of the world felt heavier, but Max wasn't stopping. He wouldn't stop. The bond between them had been forged in the fires of war, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was life and death. As they pushed through the smoke, Max's paws slipped on the scorched earth, but he pulled harder, his body shaking with the effort. Jason could barely breathe, could barely move, but he could feel the dog's warmth, his determination, and his love. Through the haze, Jason saw a flash of light. His heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, he thought it was the end. But then Max nudged him forward, urging him on with a soft whimper, as if telling him to hold on. The two of them, bound by a bond stronger than anything, pressed on. Through the chaos, through the fire, Max's loyalty shone brighter than the flames that tried to consume them both. Jason felt his strength fading, but Max wouldn't let go. He couldn't let go. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the edge of the fire, the smoke beginning to thin, the air slightly clearer. Max's body was covered in ash, his breathing labored, but his eyes were filled with a quiet resolve. He had done it. They had made it. The fire still raged behind them, but for the moment, they were safe. Jason, barely able to stay awake, reached down to touch Max's head, his fingers trembling with gratitude. Max looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with an understanding that only those who had been through the worst could know. In that moment, amidst the ashes and the chaos, Jason knew one thing for sure. There was no greater love than that of a dog who would risk everything to save you. And as he closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of Max beside him, he whispered, "Thank you, buddy. Thank you for saving my life." The air was thick with smoke, but Jason could feel the world shifting as he slowly regained consciousness. His vision blurred, but through the haze, he could make out the shape of Max, sitting patiently beside him. His loyal dog, covered in soot, looked every bit as tired as he felt, but there was something in Max's eyes, a quiet sense of pride. Slowly, Jason tried to sit up, feeling the sharp sting of pain in his chest. He could barely move. His body ached from the heat and the exertion, but he wasn't alone. Max was there, his steady presence a reminder that they had survived together. Jason reached out, his hand shaking as he patted Max's head. The dog leaned into the touch, his fur soft despite the ash that covered him. Jason's voice came out in a rasp, barely above a whisper. "We made it, buddy." Max responded with a soft whine, his amber eyes never leaving Jason's face. The world around them was eerily quiet now. The fire still raged in the distance, but for a moment, they were safe. The storm of smoke and flames had passed, and they had emerged from it, not unscathed, but alive. The memories of the fire were still fresh, the smoke still hanging in the air like a heavy curtain, but the immediate danger had passed. Jason leaned back against a charred tree, taking a deep breath. The coolness of the air felt like a blessing after the suffocating heat of the fire. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness wash over him. It was then that he realized how lucky he was, not just to have survived, but to have Max by his side. Max had saved his life, dragged him out of the fire when there was no hope left. Jason could never repay the dog for what he had done, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never let Max down. He opened his eyes and looked at the dog, a deep gratitude filling his chest. You're my hero, Max. Max wagged his tail at the sound of his name, his expression softening. It was as if he understood, as if he knew the depth of the bond between them. Jason reached down and scratched Max behind the ears, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. They had been through so much together, years of training, countless missions, and now, this. They had faced danger and survived it. They had come through it together. And now, as they sat in the quiet aftermath, Jason knew that nothing could break their bond. Max had given him another chance at life, and he would spend the rest of his days making sure he was worthy of that sacrifice. He took a deep breath, his hand still resting on Max's head. We're not done yet, buddy. We still have work to do. Max gave a soft woof, as if in agreement. They didn't need to say anything more. In that moment, they both knew that they would always be there for each other, no matter what came next. Jason felt the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders as he slowly stood, leaning on Max for support. The fire was now a distant memory, its scorching heat replaced by the coolness of the evening air. His body ached, bruised and burned, but the pain was almost comforting now. It was a reminder of how far they had come. He took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, crisp air that seemed to cleanse his lungs of the smoke. Max stood beside him, alert as always, his amber eyes scanning the horizon, ever watchful. Jason looked down at his dog, his heart swelling with gratitude. You're always there, aren't you, buddy? Max's tail wagged once, slowly, as if he understood the significance of the moment. There was a bond between them, one forged in battle, in hardship, and in the quiet moments of trust they shared. Jason reached down, rubbing Max's head gently. The dog leaned into his touch, his body still warm from the fire. Despite the exhaustion that clung to him, Jason knew he couldn't rest yet. There was still work to do, a long road ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing that filled the silence. It was a stark contrast to the deafening roar of the flames they had just escaped. Jason felt a weight in his chest, a heaviness that came from knowing how close they had been to losing everything. But that thought was fleeting. As he looked at Max, the only family he had left, he knew they would make it through whatever came next. They always did. Jason took a step forward, testing his legs. His body protested with a sharp twinge, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through. Max stayed by his side, a silent guardian, as always. Let's get moving, Max, Jason muttered. He knew they needed to find shelter, water, and rest. But it was more than that. He needed to keep moving, to prove to himself that he was still capable, still strong. Max barked softly, his eyes locked onto Jason as if sensing his thoughts. Together, they began to walk, leaving the ruins of the fire behind them. The night was still young, and they had a long journey ahead. But Jason felt something stirring inside him, a new sense of purpose. The fire had taken so much from him, but it had also given him something back, a renewed bond with Max, a chance to rebuild, to fight on. With Max by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had survived the fire, but now it was time to survive the world outside. And whatever came their way, they would face it together. The moon hung high above them as Jason and Max continued their journey, the quiet hum of the night surrounding them. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only the crisp scent of charred earth and smoke in the air. Jason's mind was still heavy with the weight of what had happened, but with every step he took, a sense of determination pushed him forward. Max walked beside him, ever vigilant, his ears flicking at every sound, his nose catching every scent. The world around them was quiet now, but Jason knew that danger could strike at any moment. Yet, in this silence, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. A glimmer of hope. The road ahead was unclear, the landscape barren and untouched by the fire's wrath. They needed shelter, food, and water, but more than anything, Jason needed to find a sense of purpose again. He had been lost for so long, drifting from one mission to the next, never truly finding himself. But now, with Max at his side, things felt different. There was something about their bond, something unspoken, that made him believe they could face whatever came next. They walked for hours, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and Max's steady breathing. Jason's body still ached, but the pain was becoming a distant memory, a reminder of the fire they had escaped together. He could feel the cool night air against his skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax. He glanced down at Max, who was walking with his usual precision, his gaze focused ahead. The dog was more than a companion. He was a guardian, a protector, and Jason couldn't help but feel a deep gratitude for him. "We've made it this far, buddy," Jason whispered, more to himself than to Max. The dog's ears perked at the sound of his voice, and he looked up at Jason, his amber eyes filled with silent understanding. They didn't need words. They had been through so much together, fighting side by side, surviving battles that no one else could understand, and now they were facing the aftermath. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about healing, rebuilding, and moving forward. Max had given him a second chance at life, and Jason was determined not to waste it. As they continued down the path, Jason couldn't help but think of the life he had left behind, the friends he had lost, the battles he had fought, and the family he had once known. But now, in the stillness of the night, he knew that he had something worth fighting for again. Max was by his side, and that was all that mattered. "We'll make it, Max," Jason said softly, his voice steady. "We'll make it through this." Max gave a small bark, as if agreeing with him, and they pressed on, the future uncertain but full of possibilities. They had each other, and that was enough to keep going. The morning light filtered through the trees as Jason and Max made their way through the dense forest. The air was cool and crisp, the remnants of the fire now just a memory as they ventured further into the unknown. Jason's muscles still protested with each step, but his resolve was stronger than ever. With Max by his side, he felt invincible, as though nothing could stand in their way. The path they walked was quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaos they had escaped just days before. Jason's thoughts were a jumble of memories, both painful and bittersweet, but they were starting to fade into the background. The bond he shared with Max was the only thing that mattered now. As they continued, Max suddenly stopped, his head tilting to one side. Jason instinctively slowed his pace, his senses heightening. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, crouching down beside the dog. Max's amber eyes scanned the surroundings, his ears perked and his body tense. Jason looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was still, the only sounds being the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. But Max knew something was off. After a few moments, Max resumed walking, his pace more cautious now. Jason followed, his hand resting on the dog's back, trusting his companion's instincts. They walked for miles, the landscape changing as they moved deeper into the woods. The air grew thicker, the trees taller, and the shadows longer. Jason could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him, but he didn't complain. This was his life now, just him and Max, facing whatever came their way. The world had changed, and so had he. They came across a small stream, its clear waters trickling over smooth rocks. Jason knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink. Max, as always, stood by, vigilant and watchful. As Jason drank, he thought about the life he had left behind. The fire had taken so much from him, his home, his past, and the man he had once been. But as he looked at Max, he realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was the future they would build together. The past was gone, but the bond they shared would always remain. After a brief rest, they continued on, the path winding through the dense forest. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken, and Jason knew they needed to find shelter for the night. The wilderness was both beautiful and unforgiving, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. They found a small cave tucked into the side of a hill, its entrance barely visible from the trail. It wasn't much, but it would keep them safe for the night. Jason set up a small camp, lighting a fire with the few supplies he had left. Max curled up beside him, his head resting on Jason's feet. As the flames flickered and danced, Jason felt a sense of calm settle over him. They had made it this far, and as long as they had each other, they would continue to survive, to thrive. The world may have changed, but their bond would never break. Max had saved him once, and now, they were saving each other, one step at a time. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cave entrance, Jason stirred from his sleep. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the early morning light. Max was still curled up beside him, his breathing steady and calm. The night had been quiet, a welcome relief after the chaos they had endured. Jason stretched, his muscles stiff from the journey, but there was a sense of peace in the stillness of the moment. He glanced at Max, who had not moved an inch. There was a certain comfort in knowing that his dog was always by his side, always watching over him. Jason silently rose to his feet, careful not to disturb Max. The day ahead would bring more challenges, but he was ready. He had no other choice. The fire had taken so much from him, but it had also given him a second chance. As he stepped outside the cave, he was greeted by the cool morning air, the scent of pine trees filling his lungs. The world around him was calm, untouched by the destruction they had left behind. He could hear the distant sound of birds calling to each other, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was the kind of peace he had been yearning for. But Jason knew. It wouldn't last. The world had changed, and so had he. He had seen the worst, and now he was learning to live with it. He looked back at Max, who had followed him out of the cave and was now sitting by the entrance, watching him. There was something in the dog's eyes, something that said, "We'll make it through this." And for the first time in a long while, Jason believed it too. He walked back to where Max was sitting, crouching down to meet his gaze. "We've got a long road ahead, buddy," Jason said softly. Max's tail wagged once, and the dog licked his hand, a simple gesture of reassurance. It was enough. Jason stood up and began to gather their things. He packed the small supply bag he had managed to salvage, making sure they had enough food and water for the day ahead. Max trotted alongside him, his eyes scanning the area, ever vigilant. They set off down the narrow trail, the silence between them comfortable. The forest was dense, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. Jason's thoughts wandered as they walked, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. The fire had been a test, a brutal reminder of how fragile life could be. But it had also been a wake-up call. Jason wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that as long as he had Max, he could face whatever came next. The day passed slowly, the sun rising higher in the sky as they made their way through the woods. The forest was both beautiful and daunting, the shadows deepening as the trees grew thicker. Jason felt the weight of the journey pressing down on him, but he refused to stop. He couldn't. Max was counting on him. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was finally doing something right. As the day drew to a close, they found a small clearing and decided to set up camp. Jason made a fire, the crackling of the wood a soothing sound in the otherwise quiet evening. Max lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in contentment. Jason stared into the fire, the flames dancing in the dark. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he and Max would face it together. They had made it this far, and nothing was going to stop them now. The night was cold, and the fire crackled softly in the distance, its warmth a welcome comfort after the long, exhausting day. Jason sat back against a large rock, his eyes gazing at the stars above. The quiet of the wilderness enveloped him, and for a moment, he allowed himself to relax. Max lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes alert as ever. The dog's presence was a constant source of comfort, a reminder that no matter how hard things got, he was not alone. Jason thought about how far they had come, how much they had been through together. The fire had seemed like an impossible trial, yet here they were, surviving, stronger than ever. But there was still so much ahead of them. They had crossed dangerous terrain, faced extreme challenges, but the world outside this quiet camp still held unknown dangers. The thought didn't scare Jason. It made him feel alive. He had always been the type to push forward, to fight through the hardest of times. It was how he had been trained. But this was different. With Max, it felt like there was more at stake. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about finding something worth living for again. "You know, buddy," Jason murmured, looking down at Max. "I never thought I'd be here, doing this. But here we are." Max's tail wagged once, and he looked up at Jason, his expression calm, yet somehow knowing. Jason chuckled softly, reaching down to scratch the dog behind the ears. "You're not just a dog, are you? You're a hell of a partner." Max let out a quiet growl, almost as if agreeing. It was a sound that Jason had come to understand, a sound that meant more than just noise. It was a sound of understanding, of trust. They had been through too much together for words to be necessary. They both knew what they meant to each other. Jason stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. The firelight cast long shadows on the ground as he moved, but the stars above offered their quiet, steady glow. Max stood with him, always ready. "Let's see what's ahead tomorrow, huh?" Jason said as he grabbed his pack. Max followed without hesitation, his eyes scanning the surroundings, ever watchful. They didn't need to speak to know their mission. They were in this together, every step of the way. As they made their way through the forest, the night's chill wrapped around them like a blanket. But there was a sense of purpose in their steps, a quiet confidence that came from surviving the worst. They were stronger than before, but the road was long. Jason knew that, but he wasn't worried. With Max at his side, he felt unstoppable. They would face whatever came next, together. As they walked on, Jason glanced up at the stars once more, feeling a quiet peace settle in his chest. They had made it this far, and with Max by his side, he knew they could go even further. The sun was rising over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the forest. The air was still, and Jason could feel the coolness of the morning seeping into his bones. He looked down at Max, who was walking ahead of him, as steady as ever. The dog's eyes were alert, scanning the surroundings, ever watchful for any sign of danger. Jason's muscles ached from the journey, but the pain felt familiar now, like a companion he had come to accept. They had been walking for days, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jason didn't mind the silence. In fact, he welcomed it. It was in these quiet moments that he found clarity, a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. But today felt different. There was a shift in the air, something Jason couldn't quite place. As they made their way through the dense forest, Jason felt a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. Max stopped abruptly, his ears perked and his nose twitching. Jason instinctively froze, his hand resting on the handle of his pack. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Max's amber eyes locked onto something in the distance. Jason followed the dog's gaze, but saw nothing. Still, Max remained still, his body tense with alertness. "Stay close," Jason muttered, taking a cautious step forward. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. There was something in the air, something he couldn't shake. They moved forward together, the forest growing quieter as they ventured deeper. Jason's heart began to race, but he didn't know why. The trees around them seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer with each passing moment. Max was still leading the way, his every movement precise, his focus unwavering. It was then that Jason saw it, a flicker of movement ahead, just beyond the trees. His heart skipped a beat as he instinctively tightened his grip on his pack. "Max," Jason murmured, but the dog was already in motion, moving toward the unknown with a quiet confidence. Jason followed closely behind, his senses heightened. As they drew nearer, Jason could make out the shape of a small clearing. The movement he had seen earlier was now clear, two figures, standing together in the center of the clearing. One was a man, dressed in military fatigues, his face obscured by a hood. The other was a dog, a German shepherd, just like Max. The man's back was turned, but the dog's eyes were locked onto Jason and Max, watching them with a level of intelligence that made Jason's heart race. The two dogs seemed to communicate without words, their eyes meeting for a brief moment before they both turned to face their respective handlers. "Stay back, Max," Jason whispered. But Max didn't listen. With a bark that echoed through the clearing, he darted forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen Max move so fast, so determined. As the two dogs met, they stopped, their noses sniffing each other as if they had known each other for years. The strange man remained still, watching the exchange with quiet interest. Jason was frozen, unsure of what to do. Max had never reacted this way before. It was as if he recognized the other dog, as if they shared a bond that Jason couldn't understand. After a long moment, Max turned back to Jason, his eyes filled with something Jason couldn't quite place. Recognition, maybe, or something deeper. He looked at the man, then back at Jason, as if waiting for something. "What's going on here?" Jason finally asked, his voice tight. The man slowly turned around, his face still hidden under the hood. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, his voice low and steady. "I've been watching you both for a while now." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Watching us?" he asked, his voice rising. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm someone who knows what it's like to lose everything," he said, his tone filled with quiet understanding. But I also know what it's like to have someone by your side who never gives up on you. Jason looked at the man, his confusion deepening. What do you want? He asked, his voice hoarse. The man smiled, though it was barely visible under the hood. I want to help you. Both of you. I've been tracking you for days, waiting for the right moment. And now that I've found you, I can help you find what you're looking for. Jason's mind raced. What was this man talking about? And how had he been following them without Jason noticing? But before he could say anything more, Max moved forward again, pressing his nose against the man's outstretched hand. The man's smile widened, and for the first time, Jason felt a sense of calm wash over him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the help he needed. And with Max by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Jason stood there, uncertain, watching as the mysterious man extended his hand toward Max. The dog, who had always been his loyal companion, sniffed the man's palm for a moment before giving a soft nudge with his nose. The man smiled, a warm expression that made Jason feel an unexpected sense of calm. He's a good dog, the man said softly. He knows who to trust. Jason couldn't help but feel a slight tension in his chest. He had always trusted Max, but this stranger was a different story. Who was he? And why had he been watching them? The man lowered his hand slowly, stepping back a few paces. I'm sorry for startling you, he said, his voice low and steady. I just knew you needed help, and I've been trying to find you for a while now. Jason's mind raced as he looked between Max and the man. What do you mean you've been trying to find us? He asked, his voice skeptical. The man nodded, glancing down at the ground for a moment before meeting Jason's gaze again. I've been tracking you both ever since the fire. I know what you've been through, Jason, and I know what comes next. You won't have to face it alone. Jason felt his heart race. How did this man know his name? And how did he know about the fire? His confusion grew, but he held it in, refusing to let his guard down. I don't know you, Jason said firmly, his eyes narrowing. How do you know all of this? The man's expression softened, as if understanding the fear in Jason's voice. I know because I've been through it too, the man said quietly. I've lost everything. My comrades, my family, everything. But I found something worth fighting for again. Just like you. Jason's mind began to process the words, the hint of shared experience in the man's voice. Could he trust him? The thought of not being alone, of finally finding some kind of ally in this vast, unforgiving world, was tempting. But Jason knew he couldn't make decisions based on emotion. He had to be careful. Max, sensing the unease in Jason's body, moved closer, nudging his hand in reassurance. Jason glanced down at his dog, then back at the stranger. And what exactly is it you want from us? He asked, his tone steady but still cautious. The man took a step forward, his face serious. I don't want anything from you, Jason. I just want to help. You've already been through too much. I can give you the resources you need to move forward. A place to stay, supplies, and a chance to rest. Jason's heart softened slightly at the man's offer, but his instincts told him to hold off. I'm not sure I can trust you just yet, Jason said slowly. But I'll listen. The man nodded in understanding, his eyes filled with sincerity. That's all I ask. Jason felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had been alone for so long, just him and Max, navigating this unpredictable world. But maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to rebuild, to start fresh. He looked at Max, who was still watching the man, his posture relaxed but alert. Jason knew that Max would be the one to decide. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense people's true intentions. After a long moment, Jason took a deep breath and nodded. All right, he said, his voice low but resolute. We'll follow you. But I'm not making any promises. The man smiled, relief washing over him. That's all I need, Jason. Just a chance. With a shared look of understanding, Jason and the man began to walk together, the soft sound of Max's footsteps behind them. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jason felt a flicker of hope. The journey wasn't over yet, but he wasn't facing it alone anymore. And with Max by his side, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The day had passed in a blur, the quiet forest surrounding them as they followed the mysterious man down the winding path. Jason's mind raced with questions, but the answers seemed just out of reach. Max walked beside him, as steady as ever, his eyes scanning their surroundings with the vigilance Jason had come to rely on. The man, who had introduced himself as Alex, led them deeper into the woods, moving with ease, as if he knew these lands as well as his own. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but Alex's calm demeanor helped steady Jason's nerves. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that this was the beginning of a new chapter. But what that chapter would hold was still unclear. The road they had taken had led them far from the remnants of the fire, and now, as they ventured further, the woods grew denser, the trees taller. There was a sense of isolation here, an eerie quiet that made Jason feel both small and connected to something greater. The silence was broken only by the soft crunch of the leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. Jason's thoughts drifted back to the fire. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but the memories of the heat, the smoke, the feeling of helplessness still lingered. He wondered what had become of the others, his friends, his comrades. Were they still out there, trying to survive? Or had they been lost to the flames, like so much else? "You're quiet," Alex said, his voice pulling Jason from his thoughts. "Something on your mind?" Jason hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'm just thinking about everything that's happened. About the fire, about how we got here. I never imagined I'd end up like this." Alex glanced over at him, his expression unreadable. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. "Sometimes, that's all we need to keep going. Hey, reason to keep moving forward." Jason met his gaze, unsure of how to respond. There was a quiet sincerity in Alex's voice, but Jason couldn't bring himself to fully trust this man just yet. After all, they had only just met. But something about his words resonated with Jason. Maybe that's what he needed, a reason to keep going. A purpose. They walked for what seemed like hours, the path narrowing as they moved deeper into the heart of the forest. Finally, Alex stopped, turning to face Jason. "We're almost there," he said. "I've got a place where you and Max can rest, and we can talk about what comes next." Jason felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He had no idea what to expect, but the promise of rest was something he hadn't had in days. The weight of exhaustion was starting to take its toll on him, and the idea of a safe place to sleep, even for a night, was incredibly tempting. "Lead the way," Jason said, his voice weary but determined. Alex nodded, and without another word, he turned and continued down the trail. Jason followed closely behind, Max trotting beside him, his eyes still alert. The forest was darkening as the evening approached, the last traces of daylight fading into the horizon. The air grew cooler, and Jason pulled his jacket tighter around him, thankful for the warmth it provided. Soon, they reached a clearing. At the edge of the clearing stood a small cabin, its wooden walls worn but sturdy, nestled against a backdrop of trees. Smoke curled up from a chimney, and the warm glow of a fire could be seen through the small window. Alex walked up to the door and knocked lightly, waiting for a response. After a moment, the door opened, and an older man appeared, his face weathered but kind. "Alex," the man greeted, stepping aside to let them in. "It's good to see you." Jason glanced at Max, then back at the cabin. It wasn't much, but it looked safe. It looked like a place where they could finally rest, even if only for a little while. As they entered the cabin, the warmth of the fire welcomed them, and Jason felt a sense of relief wash over him. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. A place where he and Max could heal, and where they could finally move forward, one step at a time. The cabin was simple but comforting, the crackling fire casting warm shadows on the walls. Jason stood by the hearth for a moment, soaking in the heat as it reached through his cold, aching muscles. Max padded over to a small rug near the fireplace, lying down with a sigh, his body finally relaxing after days of constant motion. Jason watched the dog for a moment, feeling the bond they shared more deeply than ever before. They had been through so much together, and now, here they were, alive, together, in a place that felt like a brief respite. Alex, who had introduced them to the cabin, moved to the small wooden table at the center of the room. He began to prepare something on the stove, the scent of something savory beginning to fill the air. "You two must be starving," he said, glancing over his shoulder. Jason nodded, grateful for the warmth and the simple gesture of kindness. It had been days since he had eaten a proper meal, and the thought of food brought a wave of relief. "Thanks," Jason replied quietly, his voice hoarse from the days of travel and little rest. He moved to sit by the fire, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. Max lifted his head, watching Jason, his eyes full of quiet understanding. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was emotional too. The fire, the endless walking, the uncertainty about what came next, it had all taken a toll. And yet, here in this cabin, with Max by his side, there was a small sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Alex set 2 bowls of stew on the table, inviting Jason to join him. "It's not much, but it'll keep you going," Alex said with a smile, his tone warm. Jason stood and walked over, grateful for the hospitality. He didn't know how much longer he would be able to trust Alex, but for now, he felt safe. He took a seat at the table and began eating, the warmth of the food filling him in ways he hadn't expected. As he ate, he glanced around the cabin, noting the modest furnishings. A couple of chairs by the fire, a small table, and a cot in the corner, clearly meant for a traveler. It was clear that Alex had been living alone here for a while. After a few moments, Alex sat down across from him. "I know this isn't much, but it's enough to get by for a while," Alex said, his voice steady. "You and Max are welcome to stay as long as you need. There's no rush. The world outside can wait a bit." Jason nodded, his gratitude mixed with the lingering unease he still felt. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice low. "I mean, what do we do now?" Alex leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "Well, that depends on you. We can rest here, rebuild. But I think you both know the world doesn't stop just because we want it to. There's a lot of ground left to cover." Jason looked down at his bowl, stirring the stew absent-mindedly. He had no clear answer. His life had been defined by missions, by moving from one goal to the next. But now, the goal was unclear. What was his purpose now? He had lost so much, and yet, here was a chance to start again. Maybe Alex was right. Maybe they needed to rest, to rebuild, and to figure out what came next. "I don't know what I'm looking for," Jason admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I don't want to be alone anymore." Alex's expression softened, and he nodded. "You're not alone, Jason. Not anymore." The words were simple, but they held a weight that Jason felt deep in his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like there was a chance for something more. A chance to heal, to move forward, and to find a new purpose with Max by his side. Jason finished his meal in silence, his thoughts swirling around the uncertainty of the future. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to rest. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, whatever new chapter awaited him. But tonight, he was not alone. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The morning light filtered through the small window of the cabin, casting soft beams onto the worn wooden floor. Jason stretched as he woke, feeling the stiffness in his muscles, a reminder of the long journey he had been on. Max, as always, was by his side, lying near the fire that had burned low during the night. The peaceful silence of the cabin was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days, and for the first time in a long time, Jason allowed himself to take a deep breath and simply be still. He glanced at the fire and then at Max, who had opened his eyes at the slightest movement, his amber gaze meeting Jason's. There was a quiet understanding between them. They had both been through so much together, yet here they were, alive, safe for the moment, and perhaps, just perhaps, on the edge of a new beginning. Jason slowly got to his feet, stretching again, then walked over to the small table where Alex had set down a few maps the night before. His mind still buzzed with uncertainty about what came next. They could stay here in this cabin for a while, but the world outside was far from forgiving. Jason felt the pull of the road, the urge to keep moving, to find some purpose once more. As he stood there, looking over the maps, Alex entered the room, his face serious but calm. "Morning," Alex said, his voice low and steady. "How did you sleep?" Jason met his gaze for a moment before replying. "Better than I have in a while," he admitted. "But I can't stay here forever. There's something calling me to move forward. I can't just sit and wait." Alex nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know," he said quietly, "but you've been through a lot. You deserve some rest." Jason turned his attention back to the map, his finger tracing the path that lay ahead. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he had to take the first step. "I can't just rest," Jason said, almost to himself. "There's still too much out there. People who need help, things I need to understand." Max stood up, walking over to Jason and nudging his hand with his nose. Jason smiled faintly, his hand resting on Max's head. "You're right, buddy," he said softly. "We'll figure it out. One step at a time." Alex watched them for a moment before speaking again. "If you're set on moving forward, then you don't have to do it alone. I can help you, show you the way. There are others who have been through what you've gone through, surviving, rebuilding. We're not all lost." Jason looked at Alex, considering his words. It wasn't easy to trust anyone after everything he had been through, but there was something in Alex's voice, something in the way he carried himself, that made Jason feel like maybe, just maybe, this was a path worth exploring. "All right," Jason said, finally meeting Alex's gaze. "I'll go with you. But I need to know everything. I need to understand what comes next." Alex gave a slow nod, a look of determination in his eyes. "I'll tell you everything I know," he said. "But it's not going to be easy. The world's a different place now. But if you're ready to face it, we'll find our way through." Jason felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. The journey ahead would be tough, but with Max by his side and Alex's guidance, maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild, to move forward, and to find hope once more. "Let's do it," Jason said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Together, they would face whatever came next. The next morning, Jason felt an unfamiliar sense of readiness. The sun had risen fully, its light brightening the cabin as it spilled through the cracks in the wooden walls. Max was already awake, pacing a little near the fire, his eyes scanning the room with quiet intelligence. Jason stretched his stiff muscles, the weight of his decision from the night before settling in his chest. He had agreed to move forward with Alex, to leave the cabin and venture into an uncertain future. It was a choice born from necessity, but also from a small spark of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The fire that had taken so much from him now seemed distant, like a part of his past that he couldn't change but also couldn't allow to control him. Today would be a new beginning. As Jason gathered his things, he noticed Alex preparing something on the stove, the smell of fresh coffee filling the room. Max trotted over, nudging Jason's hand in his usual way, asking for attention. Jason smiled softly, reaching down to scratch his dog's ears. "You ready for this, buddy?" he asked, though he knew Max didn't need words to understand. Max's tail wagged slowly in response, his body standing still but full of quiet energy. Jason stood up and moved toward the table, where Alex had set out their supplies. Alex was busy packing a small bag, his movements precise, as if he had done this countless times before. Jason didn't know much about Alex's past, but it was clear he had lived through his own share of struggles. "Everything set?" Jason asked, his voice steady. Alex looked up, meeting Jason's gaze. "Almost," he replied. "We've got a long day ahead of us, but it's a good start." Jason nodded, his resolve hardening. There was no going back now. They had made the choice to move forward, and there was no point in second-guessing. The unknown stretched ahead of them, but at least they had a path to follow. As they stepped outside, the cool morning air hit Jason's face, and he took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of freedom that came with leaving the cabin behind. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. For a moment, it almost felt like a normal morning, a far cry from the chaos and uncertainty they had been living in. But as Jason looked over at Alex, who was already leading the way, he knew that their journey had only just begun. The road ahead was uncertain, but with Max by his side and Alex's guidance, they had a chance. Jason wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. He had come so far, and yet he still felt like something was missing. He had lost so much, his comrades, his home, his purpose, but in moving forward, maybe he could find a new reason to keep going. They walked in silence for hours, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional bark from Max as he darted ahead. Jason noticed that Alex didn't talk much, but he didn't mind. There was something comforting in the silence, in the simple act of walking together, focused on the task ahead. Eventually, they reached a small creek. The sound of running water filled the air, and Jason stopped for a moment to take a drink. Max went to the water's edge, sniffing curiously at the rippling stream. Alex, standing a few paces away, gave Jason a moment of quiet. Jason felt his mind slowing down, the rush of uncertainty fading. For the first time in a long while, He felt like he could breathe without the constant weight of fear on his shoulders. After a brief rest, they continued on, the landscape slowly changing as they moved deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, their thick branches filtering the light, casting the path in cool shadow. The air felt different here, more open, more alive. Jason glanced over at Alex, who was leading them with quiet confidence. "How much further?" Jason asked, his voice calm but curious. Alex turned back, his face softening into a faint smile. "Not much longer," he said. "We'll be there soon." Jason nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The uncertainty that had plagued him for so long was still there, lurking in the back of his mind. But now there was something else. Something that made him believe that the road ahead, however difficult, would be worth walking. With Max at his side and Alex guiding them, he felt ready for whatever came next.